Okay, it's about 3 after 1, so I do want to be mindful of the time. So we are going to get started. If you just arrived, welcome. My name is Amber Gagliardi. I'm a librarian here at the Middle Country Public Library, so I can certainly answer any questions that you have about any upcoming programs or what's going on in the library. I will be here through the duration of the program, so you could always send me a message in the chat box. This is set up as a webinar, so you'll be able to see and hear our presenter, but we cannot see or hear you. So the best way of communicating with us is by using the chat box. The chat box is located at the bottom of your screen, which is right down on the below on the icon that says chat. So if you click that, it'll come up. There are 2 options. There's an option to select all panelists or all panelists and attendees. When asking a question, we do ask that you select all panelists and attendees in case somebody has the same question, and it just makes for a live program where everyone can interact and see what everyone else is thinking. We are going to get started. Just note that we are recording this program, so people can watch it in the future. But again, we cannot see or hear you, so that shouldn't be a concern to anyone. But if you are, just be mindful of that. Just want to give everyone that information. Let's go ahead and get started because I'm really excited about this program, all about hydrangeas. I obviously picked it. I love hydrangeas. I have them all around my yard, and I just think they are one of my favorite, flowers to look at. And I love dried hydrangeas that I can enjoy throughout the year. So without further ado, Alice, if you want to take it over, I will hide behind the camera.
Yeah, I'm going to hide as well. All right. So, happy Thursday to everyone. We're here to talk about hydrangeas. My name is Alice Raimondo. I'm a horticulture consultant working for the Cornell Cooperative Extension of Suffolk County. I have been with Cornell Cooperative Extension for 19 and a half years now, I guess, working in the horticulture diagnostic lab. So before we talk about hydrangeas, let me just give you a little background on what we do at Cornell Cooperative Extension in our horticulture diagnostic lab. I'm assuming that everyone is here because not only do we like hydrangeas, but perhaps we're gardeners or just like to be outdoors in our yard. We provide a wonderful service. If you're not aware of what we do run a horticulture hotline, so you can contact us in the mornings from 9 a.m. to 12 noon, Monday through Friday. That number is 631-727-4126. And you can basically ask us anything gardening, insect related, plant problems, lawn care, when to prune things, indoor house plants. It really runs the gamut, vegetable gardening and more. So certainly feel free to reach out to myself and my coworker, Sandra. We're the only 2 actually in charge of the lab. You can also feel free to drop me an email if there's questions beyond what gets covered in the scope of our presentation today. Or, again, anything you are questioning in your garden, feel free to drop me an email. And I'll put up my email again later at the end of the presentation. So since we're here to talk about hydrangeas, we're going to talk about why do we grow hydrangeas? Well, one of the reasons we grow hydrangeas is for that lovely picture on the screen. We want to have beautiful, bountiful flowers that we can either cut to put in a vase or to dry, or certainly just to go out and enjoy the beautiful colors of this relatively easy to grow shrub. And I say relatively easy because for those of you that may have problems, we're going to cover a lot of those issues as we go through the presentation. To have beautiful hydrangeas like that on the screen there, we need to talk about the general growing conditions. We will cover the basic types and species that are commonly grown in most Long Island gardens. We're going to spend a fair amount of time on how to prune them correctly, because that's a very critical thing to know how and when to prune them so that you do get the flowers that you're growing this plant for. We, of course, being that I'm from the horticulture diagnostic lab, we're definitely going to be covering insect disease and cultural problems that can make your plant look a lot less desirable, not like the one here on the photo. So some general growing conditions for all the different types of hydrangeas, and there might be some specifics that'll be a little bit different. Morning sun is definitely the best. So if you can protect hydrangeas from the hot afternoon sun or provide them with good, strong dappled light all day, they're going to actually perform the best in terms of flowering where they're getting good morning sun. You may find things like floppy flower stems or spindly growth. If you have that on your hydrangea, that's a good indication of not enough sun. Certainly, if you have very few flowers, that's also an indication of not enough sun. The oak leaf and smooth hydrangeas can actually do a little bit better in terms of less sun and still provide you with flowers. The panicled hydrangea, so like what's called the PG hydrangea, certainly is one that tolerates a fair amount of sun. So that could be full hot sun all day. And the smooth hydrangea, even though it can go from pretty shady conditions, it can also go into very, very strong sun. So that's a very adaptable hydrangea species. Too much sun can actually cause a plant to wilt. If it gets to the point of wilting when the flowers are out, you can actually destroy the flowers, can cause flower burn or a foliage burn, even if the sun has good moisture. So this is pretty common in the Hydrangea Macrophylla or the mophead, the common hydrangeas that are grown here. Regards to soil, hydrangeas do tend to prefer pretty good dense soil in terms of organic matter. You do want to have a soil that holds some moisture, but certainly not one that has poor drainage. And they definitely do prefer a soil that's on the acidic range. When you're talking about the Hydrangea Macrophylla or the big leaf hydrangeas, they are sensitive to pH in terms of their color of the flower. So Hydrangea Serrata, which is the mountain hydrangea, also can be affected by soil pH. So if you look at that little picture there on the screen, towards the right end would be the more acidic end, and towards the left end would be what you would find where the plants were in a higher pH soil. So with a 5 to 5.5, which is pretty acidic, you'll get a nice true blue color. You'll get sort of a mottled or a purplish color where you're getting a little bit higher and closer to neutral, 5.5 to 6 or so. And then when you get up to about a 6 or even higher than a 6, you'll have mostly pink. And sometimes you'll get a really deep pink if you start to really get up into that neutral range around 7. So we have to talk about how to water hydrangeas correctly. Watering in the landscape is probably one of the misunderstood things that we get calls about on our information line. And it's a very common mistake not to water correctly. Hydrangeas are certainly one of those plants that will let you know when they don't have enough water. Certainly droopy leaves and droopy flower heads like that hydrangea in the photo there is a good indication that the plant is drought stressed. It can also be an indication of the plant being in too much sun or just where there's too much, heat. So you want to always check the soil moisture before you decide to go and water again. Too much water can actually cause a similar symptom because you actually can be encouraging root rot and things like that. So be aware that a newly planted hydrangea certainly can do a lot of wilting in its first week or so. Even with adequate water, they can be a little bit fickle. About an inch of water per week is about what's needed. And that holds true for not just hydrangeas, but for most new shrubs that you put in. 1 inch to 2 inches a week, depending upon what your soil texture is like. Avoiding overhead sprinklers. Overhead sprinklers can really be troublesome to hydrangeas, and we'll show you some photos of that as we go on. They're pretty prone to leaf spot diseases, and unfortunately, with all this wet weather that we've had, It might not even be the overhead sprinklers that'll be a problem, but just all the rainfall that we've had causing all sorts of leaf spot diseases. Most of them are not too significant, but they can certainly make your plant not look as pretty as it would without the spots. So with regard to the types of hydrangeas that we grow here, one of the more lovely ones that people do grow in partially shaded locations is this beautiful native hydrangea called Hydrangea Aquaricofolia, which is the oak leaf hydrangea. The oak leaf common name is derived from the appearance of their leaves, which certainly do resemble oak leaves. It is a fairly slow growing hydrangea, and the panicles can be combined with, there can be combined of sterile and fertile flowers. So you can have variations in the types of flowers that you see depending upon the cultivar. And there are many cultivars out there. These are beautiful shrubs when they start to mature. The bark develops a nice peeling kind of look to it. So even without leaves in the winter, it can be a pretty attractive looking shrub. The variety on the left there called Ruby Slippers is one of the varieties that's been bred for a good color when the flowers are starting to fade. So Hydrangea Aquaricofolia flowers start off greenish white, mature to a true white, and then as they really age and they start to become that good stage to kind of harvest them, if you wanted to pick dried flowers, they'll turn to more of that pinkish kind of interesting corally pinkish kind of color, which is very evident there on that variety Ruby Slippers. Snowflake is a really lovely variety. Peewee is a dwarf variety. Then this is Queen of Hearts, which is an older variety, which I have in my garden, which I love the shape of the panicles with the few sterile flowers and lots more fertile flowers. When we talk about sterile and fertile flowers, which I'll mention as we go along, if you're looking for flowers that are actually providing some sort of a nectar or pollen for our native pollinators, then you want to look for ones that don't just have those large showy florets. You're really looking for the ones that have the little tiny flowers, which are actually fertile flowers and do provide some sort of nourishment to native pollinators. So like you look at our mophead pollinators, our mophead flowers, there's really not much there. So you'll often not see any kind of bees or any kind of insects working the flowers. Hydrangea Arborescens is another native hydrangea, which is native to the moist or rocky wooded slopes, ravines, the stream banks, from New York to Florida, west to Iowa, Missouri, Oklahoma, Louisiana. So it has a pretty broad range in the United States. The typical wild form there on the left is what you would expect to see growing in the woods, where it's mostly fertile flowers with maybe a few sterile florets. So the appearance of the flower head is quite different than the ones that have been bred to produce these large flowers. So in the center there is one that's a pink variety, and you can see that one has been created, to have large flowers, and it's a pink flower variety. Incredible and Invincible Ruby. Those are really pretty, pretty varieties and improvements. Probably the most common one that we see grown is the Annabelle, the Hydrangea Arborescens Annabelle. And these are really great plants for northern climate. They're very hardy. They do flower on the new growth. So even if they're knocked back by frost or very cold temperatures, they'll push out lots of new growth. And then you'll get lots of flowers on that new growth. Hydrangea Serrata, this is a non-native. It's from the mountains of Korea and Japan, similar to the big leaf hydrangea in terms of the flower types. It is more compact in size in both form of plant and also in bloom size. Does tend to be less impacted by winter injury, which we'll talk about pretty extensively when we start talking about the big leaf hydrangea. And for my personal opinion, it's a very underutilized hydrangea. You can find flowers that are lace cap or mop head, so very much like you would find with Macrophylla. And it tends not to be as big of a problem in the landscape in terms of the size. The plants are way more compact, so folks don't really have to do too much pruning, which is nice, so they can't make the mistake of pruning them at the wrong time and then not having any flowers at all, which is something that we do certainly hear about. The varieties on the left there, that's tough stuff in both a higher and a lower pH soil, just to give you the idea of what it would look like. Little Geisha is a pretty pink mop head variety, and Tiara is a really lovely kind of lavender colored flower head in like about a pH of 6. There are lots of these varieties around. Also, many of them do have like a Japanese name. This happens to be Hydrangea Serrata Benigaku, which is really pretty variety that I've grown for many years, and it's very floriferous, very lighter textured plant because it does have a smaller leaf, smaller flower head. So some people maybe think it's not quite as showy, but it's very easy to grow, very adaptable. This happens to be another Hydrangea Serrata type. This is Preziosa, which does have a beautiful reddish stem. And you can see that photo there to the lower right is how the flowers start off sort of creamy pink in color, and then they'll mature to more of a lavender pink when they're fully open. It's at that stage that you would want to pick them if you did want to put them in a vase. Hydrangea Serrata, I think, is the last of the Serrata varieties that I wanted to show you. This is Blue Billows, really pretty variety. It's been around for a while. Will stay a nice true blue in an acidic soil, probably 5 to 5.5, or maybe just under 6. Really, like, you can see the nice form that it has, maybe 3 foot by 3.5 foot wide. Nice mounding habit, really doesn't require any pruning, doesn't require any staking, just so easy to grow and carefree. Hydrangea Paniculata. So this is what's commonly called the PG hydrangea. This is another hydrangea native to China and Japan. Easy to grow plant. It's really great for northern climates. So I don't know if you go up into New England, you'll rarely see our common big leaf hydrangea, the thing that most people think of when they think of hydrangea, because the Hydrangea Macrophylla will not survive up in cold climates. It'll actually get killed back to the ground every year. So you'll never have the blooms because they flower on the old wood. What's nice about Hydrangea Paniculata is it's way more hardy as it produces new growth, and it's on that new growth that the flowers are produced. So this makes it a much more flexible plant, and it's also a great plant that tolerates a fair amount of pruning. Some really great varieties on the screen there. Tardiva is a really old-fashioned variety, which I love because the pollinators really do love this plant. Has lots of the little fertile flowers, and then very few of the sterile, really ornamental flowers. But it's a nice combination. It also happens to be quite fragrant. So if you put your nose up into that, you can smell something very sweet, which is another unusual thing about hydrangeas. But certainly a lot of the paniculata types do tend to actually have some fragrance to them. Much like the oak leaf hydrangea, there's been a lot of breeding improvements to kind of take advantage of how the flowers mature and what color they change into as they age. Pinky Winky and Strawberry Sunday, as you can imagine their name is implying, they do, as the flowers mature, particularly the sterile flowers, they'll start to take on a nice deep pink coloration, which almost gives you like a second bloom. So they start off being white, and then they'll gradually, go to more of this pink coloration, and even to sort of a deep rosy color. So it almost looks like you've got 2 blooms on these plants. Hydrangea Paniculata Limelight, known for its really big flower heads, sometimes so large that they kind of bow over and they wind up laying on the ground if you haven't done a good job of pruning them correctly. This was probably one of the first varieties that came out on the market. As you can see on that photo there in the center of the screen towards the bottom there, this one doesn't fade to as much of a pink color as those pink varieties that I showed you, but it does sort of take on a greenish with a bit of a pinkish tint to it, which is the perfect time to be harvesting them for dried flower arrangements, and also certainly just to be putting them in the vase. Hydrangea flowers, as a rule, when you cut them and you want to bring them inside, you really want to have mature flowers. So waiting until you start to see that little bit of a color change, when you know the flowers are more papery, that's when you know they're going to hold up the best. They're also going to dry the best that well. So here's our most common hydrangea that everybody knows and loves. This is Hydrangea Macrophylla, which is known as the big-leafed hydrangea or the florist hydrangea, the hortensia hydrangea, goes by lots of different names, moped. They are certainly originally from Japan. This is the one where you'll find the most varieties with all different flower forms and certainly all different colors. There's also some that will bloom not only on the old wood, but some that are repeat bloomers, which will bloom on the new wood as well. So those are reblooming types. There's a series called Endless Summer, which is a pretty common series. That one there on the screen happens to be a white, very, very pale pink, probably more a creamy white, called Blushing Bride. It does bloom on both the old and the new wood. The one in the center there is Aisha, which has an interesting flower form. Almost doesn't look like a hydrangea to me. The variety on the right-hand side is called Bloomstruck. That's very similar to that, that Serrata variety that I showed you before with the reddish stems. The flowers start off kind of creamy, greenish pink, and then will mature to a deeper pink as they are on the plant. Fuji Waterfall is another one of these interesting lace cap types where you've got these long peduncles, I guess, where the flowers are attached. And then the interesting little florets of the fertile flowers. Blue Danube is a improved version of Nico Blue, giving you that really big true blue flower head, particularly if your soils are acidic. And then Edgy Orbits is another one of these interesting lace cap picot sort of varieties where you've got both pink and white on the florets, the sterile florets. Nico Blue is probably the most widely grown, most common variety out there. So this is the one that most people do think of when they think of Nico Blue. It tends not to be as affected by soil pH and tends to stay pretty blue. It may get a little bit to a dirtier colored blue if the pH gets a little bit higher. So when you start to get above 6.5, it'll probably start to get more lavendery. But it is one that does tend to stay pretty blue. So not as pH sensitive. And then a couple of lace cap varieties here. This is Blue Wave and Lemon Wave. Both of these are growing in pretty acidic conditions because they're staying pretty true to their color form. There's lots of lace cap varieties out there. When I say lace cap, I'm talking about a flower head that has both the sterile florets sort of ringing the outside of the flower head, and then it has the fertile flowers towards the center, which are the smaller flowers. I have to include Hydrangea Anomala Petiolaris for those of you that may want to try to do something growing hydrangeas vertically. This happens to be a vining type of hydrangea, which is also native to Japan, Korea, and Siberia. It is capable of attaching itself to structures stone, masonry walls, tree trunks, wooden fences, and such by aerial roots. It's a really great plant for sort of a partially sunny or a little bit more shaded situation. And it does have flower heads that are more lace cap. A fully grown, mature specimen of climbing hydrangea is quite lovely when it's in bloom. It does take a couple of years to become established, but if you do have a spot, I would highly recommend trying to grow one of these. They're quite beautiful. So since we're talking about all the different flowers, we might want to actually see flowers on our hydrangeas. So let's talk about why you might not actually have flowers. If you've not been pruning them correctly, so doing improper shearing or renewal prunings of either the mountain hydrangea, Hydrangea Serrata, or the big leaf hydrangea, you may be actually removing the flowers before you even had a chance to see them. Deer are a huge problem, and deer are certainly doing the same thing. Deer love to graze on hydrangeas as well as lots of other things in the landscape. And honestly, it can be very hard to grow things like hydrangeas if you do have a deer pressure in your property. Frost injury, which is a big problem for Hydrangea Macrophylla, and I'll show you some photos of that as we go along. Hydrangea Macrophylla especially is impacted by cold temperature damage when we get into even late February, early March or so. They tend to break dormancy very early, and we get wide fluctuations in temperatures that time of the year, and often it does kill the flower buds. So if you have one of these old-fashioned varieties that does flower on the old wood, then you're going to be out of luck because you'll find only new growth occurring from the base, which means that you won't be having any flowers. So doing any kind of pruning too late after it flowers. So you had flowers, let's say, and you went out and you did some pruning, but you pruned in early September. Well, you can't prune a Macrophylla type that blooms only once any later than the last week of July, and maybe you could scrape by with the first week of August or so, because you do need time for that plant to produce the buds that it's going to need to hold on to the plant through the winter, which will be your flowers for the next year. It's a very hard thing to explain, is that most of your spring blooming shrubs are plants that are flowering on the old wood. So you always have to be conscientious of how you prune. Those that flower later in the season can be pruned early in the season because they're flowering on the new wood. And hopefully there's a chart that I'll show you that hopefully will clarify that a little bit. Excessive shade is another big reason why hydrangeas may not bloom. So although many are very tolerant of shade, if their shade is very dense, there won't be enough sun for them to actually produce flower buds. Over fertilization, particularly with high nitrogen fertilizer, can actually produce lots of vegetative growth at the expense of producing flower buds. So you want to be careful when you're fertilizing. Realize that most plants, once they're in the landscape for several years, do not need to be fertilized on a regular basis. So here's my little chart that hopefully that helps you try to figure out when is the right time to prune something based on when it flowers. I've broken it out by when it blooms, just to give you an idea of when you want to prune. So when you're looking at big leaf hydrangea, mountain hydrangea, and oak leaf hydrangea, as well as the climbing hydrangea, you're looking at blooms which can start as early as mid-May, but typically you're looking more at late May and into June. These are plants that flower on the old wood. So these are things that if you did want to prune, you want to prune them as the blooms are starting to fade. So when they get to that point where they're taking on all those weird mottled colors and they're feeling very papery, that would be the time to do the pruning. That will ensure that you'll have flowers again the following year. Now, of course, you don't need to prune. Everybody thinks they have to prune. Usually people prune because they're trying to control the size of a plant. So keep that in mind. Pruning isn't something that needs to be done every year. Then you look at those that flower in July and August and even into September, such as the panicled hydrangea or the smooth hydrangea. These can actually be pruned in the late winter, early spring, just prior to the onset of growth. So let's just sort of sum all this up. Pruning hydrangeas, one of the most asked questions when it comes down to hydrangeas. And my comment, and I can't say it enough, is when in doubt, don't prune. If you feel uncertain about what variety you have, a good rule of thumb for all types of hydrangeas is that no pruning is better than the wrong type of pruning. Because why are we growing them? For the flowers. So we need to know what we're doing when we're pruning. You could take a simplified approach, which is suitable for all types of hydrangeas. Limit your pruning to any kind of winter killed wood. So certainly remove all dead branches in the spring. You can check to see if the wood's dead by scraping the bark with your knife or your thumbnail. If it's green underneath, leave it. If it's not green underneath, it's dead and should be removed. You can do what's called a rejuvenation pruning. So that means that even on healthy hydrangea, you can get old wood that dies back. In the early spring, you want to take out the oldest stems or any dead wood, cutting them to the base of the plant. And that will allow room for the new growth to spring up, and it doesn't have all this old wood to compete with. And this will actually encourage a more vigorous bloom set later in the summer for the following year. Certainly the removal of old dead flowers. So when you get towards that, August or September, and you've got all these dried flower heads on, you can always do what's just called deadheading, where all you're doing is you're taking off the flower heads to the next set of buds. It's really something that you can't make a mistake with. Many folks like to leave their dead flowers or dried up flowers on the plants, and often winter will prune them off. The wind and the snow will generally take them off on their own. So it's not something that you need to do. So just a few more things about pruning. That little illustration there gives you an idea of how to remove the old flower heads like I was just describing. Just prune them to the next set of leaves. If there's any frost damaged wood, you could certainly prune that out to where you find a pair of healthy buds. And then any of the dark colored stems or any of the branch stems, this is particularly on a Macrophylla type, can be pruned out, as those are stems that flowered last year. And if you look at that photo there on the right, the lighter colored unbranched stems would be the ones that you would want to leave. Those will be the ones that would bloom this year. So the photo on the right there would be as if you went out there in March or maybe April or so and took a look at it and said, okay, I want to prune. What do I prune? So like I said, branched and darker stems could be removed. Those flowered last year. And if you take those all out, you're leaving more room for those lighter colored stems to actually push out all their growth. This is the smooth hydrangea. This is Hydrangea Arborescens, which can be safely pruned in the spring or late winter because it will produce flowers on the new growth. Frequently, all the old stems are killed during the winter months anyway, unless it's in a sort of protected location, which certainly this one is up against a brick wall. This is a lovely Hydrangea Paniculata, and with correct pruning, you can see the flower stalks are nice and short and easily supporting these big flower heads. So that's something you want to keep in mind with Hydrangea Paniculata, is that if you prune them hard in the spring, in April or so, it does produce a lot of nice, thick new growth, and the flowers are certainly going to be kept at eye level where you can enjoy them. Pruning Hydrangea Paniculata is very similar to pruning butterfly bush or rose of Sharon and some other flowering shrubs that are later season bloomers. With regard to Hydrangea Paniculata, many folks do grow them as a standard or a tree form. And I kind of think of that the same way. In the spring, before the new growth starts, you want to prune out about a third of each length of each flowering stalk, and give you kind of an irregular look. So it doesn't quite look like a little mounded ball. So I say a somewhat irregular, quote unquote, ball on a stick. And you can imagine that the ends of all these pruning cuts is where the new growth is going to come from. And then you'll have new flowers like this. And certainly, if these flowers were still attractive at the end of the winter, they could still be harvested and used for dried flower arrangements. I like to actually spray paint them when they're this dry. We're going to talk a little bit about propagation of hydrangeas. They are a fairly easy plant to propagate, and certainly named varieties are for your own use only. You can't be selling them because many of them are trademarked, and that's illegal when there's plant patents. Nearly all common hydrangea types, so Hydrangea Macrophylla, Serrata, Arborescens, Aquaricofolia, and Peniculata, will root pretty easily from 1 to 2 node cuttings, taken as a softwood tip cuttings anytime this time of the year through July. If you take cuttings later in the season, so the wood has hardened off a bit, they'll take a little bit longer, but they will usually root well. Using a rooting hormone of 1,000 parts per million IBA, which is a rooting hormone, will improve your success rate, but generally you don't need to even use rooting hormone like root tone or something. Usually rooting will occur in 2 to 3 to 4 weeks, but it could take as long as 6 weeks or so, especially if you're using more mature wood. And then rooted cuttings are easily planted into a protected garden location, or you can certainly overwinter them in their pots in a frost-free, unheated location while they're dormant. This is a really great method to make lots of plants if you have lots of plants to take cuttings from, and you can, afford to take a few pieces from this plant, a few pieces from that plant, and a great way to kind of spread your plants around in your yard. So this is just a little photographic display of how to take the cuttings. So here you've got a few nodes. You remove the lower leaves so that you're getting at least 2 nodes into the soil. This is a moist potting soil. You stick your cuttings in there, trim the big leaves to make it easier to cover, and then usually cover it up with clear plastic, or put it in a Ziploc bag or something like that. And keep it moist and in a relatively bright location, and then you'll get roots in like I said, 4 to 6 weeks. Another method that you can use for producing new plants, and probably the easiest kind of carefree way, because you don't have to worry about keeping an eye on the cutting. This allows you to make a few new plants, and not worry about them. So you can actually bend a branch down, cover it with soil, and actually apply some rooting hormone to it, and then cover some soil back over it, put a brick down, and within several weeks, you'll develop little root hairs out of those node areas. Once you've got a decent amount of roots, it can be severed from the main plant, and then planted, either potted up or planted elsewhere in the garden, and can be treated just as if it was done the other method. So this is called air layering. It's a really easy way to grow hydrangeas, and probably one of the most common way. If you have large hydrangeas that flop over and they've been laying there for a season, you may find when you try to bring them up that you might actually have some roots developing. So it's something that can happen in nature also. So take a look at those large hydrangeas and see if you've got some that are air layering. So here's my real forte, because I work in the diagnostic lab, and most folks don't talk to us when their plants are happy. They talk to us when their plants are not happy. And hydrangeas are certainly one of those plants that very often is not happy. And let's talk about some of those reasons for that. As I mentioned to you earlier, Hydrangea Macrophylla, so again, the common florist hydrangea or mop head hydrangea, is very prone to winter injury. So if you look at that photo there on the left, this is typically what happens to my hydrangea. And that's actually a photo of my hydrangea there on the right. It's in a very sunny location, very windy location. And those little flower buds, without fail, almost every year get fried by the cold weather. They push out growth, come very early in the spring, and then they get hit by, you know, freezing temperatures, and I wind up with a lovely green shrub with no flowers. So if this happens to you and you see all these you know, dead stems and all the new growth at the base, unfortunately that plant isn't going to bloom for you. I've suggested to folks over the last few years, this winter it doesn't look like the winter damage was as bad. But in years prior, one of the recommendations that I've made, if you can stand to look at a burlap screen, I'm not suggesting you wrap the plant, but that you actually create, put stakes in the ground, put burlap up against those stakes and actually shade the plant. A hydrangea growing in a full southern exposure during the winter time is going to be more apt to winter burn because the flower buds, or the buds in general, push out growth so much earlier because the temperatures start to warm up and the plant gets triggered into breaking dormancy. So if you can keep the plant cooler by shading it, it's a really effective means to prevent those buds from breaking their dormancy and hopefully protecting that growth so that you'll actually see flowers. My hydrangea this year looks like I actually do have some flowers. I did get some dead dieback from the winter, but not as much as it's been in years past. One of the common insect pests that we see is what's called chili thrips. These are really troublesome insects. They do a lot of damage to the leaves and can make the leaves almost look like they experience some sort of chemical burn or herbicide damage or something. They are very tiny insects that is not believed to overwinter here, but rather does arrive on the first warm winds that come up from the south. They cause lots of distortion in feeding, tends not to affect the flowers, but makes the plant look rather sickly, like the leaves become kind of corrugated and rough. Very hard insect to manage. Another problem with hydrangeas, particularly of Hydrangea Paniculata, especially because most folks do grow Hydrangea Paniculata in very strong sun, drier locations, is what's called two-spotted spider mite. This can be a really big problem for hydrangeas during dry spells, especially in the height of the summer where we've got drier soil, very hot and very humid conditions. This is when two-spotted spider mite really takes off. You'll notice sort of a bronziness to the leaves. I don't know how well that photo is showing up here, but the leaves will look almost silvery, bronzy. And then if you flip the leaf over, you might actually see lots of webbing. This can be managed with neem oil or insecticidal oil, insecticidal soap, which you'll apply to the entire plant, especially to the underside of the leaves. This will actually impact your blooms. If you do have a bad spider mite infestation, you are probably not going to have very nice flowers. Hydrangea leaf tire. This is a caterpillar that's very common. Well, over the last couple of years, it's become a little bit more common. It really only shows up on smooth hydrangea. It's host specific. So if you grow smooth hydrangeas, maybe the last few weeks or so, you might have seen leaves that were sort of tied together. Inside of those tied leaves are these lovely little green caterpillars, which will feed on the flower buds as well as the leaves that they've tied up. So in essence, they'll do lots of damage to the flowers. Probably the easiest way to manage this insect is to just open up those tied up leaves and pick out the caterpillar. Some people don't like to have to deal with the insect. I usually say just pick them out and squish them. Or you can just prune out those buds. If you prune them out, you're obviously sacrificing the bloom. If you just pick the caterpillar out and the damage hasn't been done, you'll actually save your flowers for that year. I just had a call about this today. This is Cottony Scale. More specifically, the Cottony Scale, the name of this insect is describing what the ovisac or the egg sacs look like. So those cottony masses actually contain hundreds of eggs inside. The brown little dot that's attached to those masses is the female insect in the process of laying the eggs. When those eggs hatch, the little crawlers, the scale insects, will crawl all over the surface of the leaves, and they'll feed on the sap, and the plant will start to lose its vigor in high, populations. Like this is a very high population, big infestation. The plants can get sticky, and then sooty mold can actually develop on the sticky honeydew that's produced by the insect. So certainly if you have only a few leaves with them, the easiest thing to do is to pick them off before the eggs hatch. And right now the eggs have not hatched. If you do find Cottony Scale, you'll find Cottony Scale on lots of other plants. This might be Cottony Hydrangea Scale, but there is Cottony Taxus Scale. There's also Cottony Maple Leaf Scale. They're all related, and many of them do have a wide host range. So you can look under the leaves of plants at this time of the year for any one of those insects. They, other than hand picking, when they do hatch out, which is usually some point in June and into early July, you could use insecticidal soap or neem oil or horticultural oil to kill the crawlers. So hopefully to prevent the damage. As I mentioned earlier, the wet weather or overhead irrigation can cause some of these issues. These are some of the leaf spots that hydrangeas can develop, particularly Hydrangea Macrophylla, a Cercospora leaf spot, Phylosticta leaf spot, Coletotrichum. There's others that the plants can develop. Most of them are not really significant, and if you correct the watering, you shouldn't have too much of a problem. Powdery mildew can be a really big problem where plants are too crowded, where they're under a lot of shade, especially as we get into the later part of the summer, when the plants are kind of not as actively growing, where the humidity might be very high. You may find powdery mildew. For hydrangeas, and especially Hydrangea Macrophylla, where I've seen it occur the most, I don't find it to be that troublesome. Powdery mildew is kind of an interesting creature. There's lots of different plants that develop powdery mildew, and most of the mildews that attack plants tend to attack them when they're just not as vigorous. There's a powdery mildew that lilacs get. There's one that garden phlox will get. One that peonies will get, and for the most part, they're going after foliage that's kind of senescing. It's shutting down. It's not actively growing. It's pretty much done what it needs to do for the plant. So you don't really have to worry too much. But if you did want to try to control powdery mildew on the hydrangea, at the first sign of it, you could apply something like neem oil, which you probably would have to go back and apply every 7 to 10 days or so, according to the label directions. Leaf scorch and flower scorch. Again, this could occur where plants are growing in too much sun, or they've been allowed to wilt down a couple of times. This is what you could expect to see. Flower scorch there on the right, on the flower head, is likely to occur where Hydrangea Macrophylla is growing in very, very hot, dry, sunny condition. You do want to make sure that plants in full sun have enough soil moisture so that prevents that wilting. That leaf scorch symptom there on the left is more likely, you're more likely to see that where plants sort of have wilted down, and then you've rewatered them and they perk back up, and you've rewatered them and they perk back up, and you've kind of gone back and forth. You're likely to see that sort of permanent damage at that point. And of course, if you have deer, you know what this is. Deer do love to go after hydrangeas, and they love the new tender shoots and the flower heads. So if you do see things like this, it's pretty indicative of deer browsing. So somebody went off and just ripped the flowers and the leaves off. And that's pretty much all I have. So there's lots of really good reference books out there for hydrangeas. Michael Durr, who's sort of a woody plant guru, he's got a wonderful book about hydrangeas for American gardens. The Encyclopedia of Hydrangeas in the center there is really nice. It has lots of beautiful pictures of all different types of varieties. And then that book there on the right is a really nice book for those of us that are trying to grow hydrangeas in colder climates. So even cooler than us, as you get up into New England, there's lots of good recommendations on how to protect your plants or what varieties or where to site them in the north. And that's all I have.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. Does anyone have any questions at this time? It looks like we do own the hydrangeas for American Gardens. I just looked that up. So we do own one of these books.
Okay, good.
Okay, a question did pop up in the chat. Okay, let me take a look and see what they say. When is a good time for taking cuttings for propagation? Do we need to apply any hormone to cuttings for rapid growth? Which is easiest variety to grow?
So generally most hydrangeas are pretty easy to take cuttings from. And now is a really great time to take cuttings of pretty much all of them. What you're looking for is the semi hardened off kind of green wood. So it's all the new wood. And you really would be looking at maybe 2 to 3 inch length cuttings with maybe 2 or 3 pairs of leaves. And you'd want to remove the lower pair of leaves. So you have that node area where the leaves were attached. And you can just stick that cutting into potting soil. I just like to use sterile potting soil that's moist. You really don't even need to use rooting hormone. And typically this time of the year, you can even leave the cuttings outside. If you have kind of a shady location, you don't even really need to cover them with plastic. You can just put them in a shady spot and just make sure that they retain their moisture. And they might wilt up a little bit during the day, but they'll perk back up at night. And you should get roots pretty quickly. I mean, 2 to 3 weeks with cuttings that are taken in June, that's probably about what you'd expect. And I don't feel like rooting hormones even necessary.
Okay, great. All right, Kathy did ask a question in here. So she has the Dark Angel hydrangea.
Okay.
Is that a macrophylla?
I don't know. I'm not familiar with that one. Let's see. Dark Angel. Does it bloom early or is it a late bloomer?
The leaves are very dark.
Okay. It's a macrophylla. I just looked it up. Yeah. That's a pretty one. Yeah, so that sounds like that's a macrophylla or a big leaf type. So that is one that does bloom on the old wood. Great.
Yeah, there's so many varieties out there, and a lot of things have so many different names. I've been using a plant identification, and then things come up and there's like 7 different names because everyone just has a different take on the name of something.
Yeah, well, and so many other varieties, if you don't actually have the tag, you don't even know what variety you have anymore because there can be so many varieties that look very similar. It's like trying, I mean, often we'll get photos of a rose and somebody will say, can you tell me what the name of this rose is? I'm like, no.
Yeah, yeah.
It's just not possible, you know?
It's your rose.
Yeah, exactly.
Name it whatever you would like.
Yep.
Well, that was great. Thank you so much.
You're
It's
welcome.
a great resource that the lab is open almost every day, and people could ask questions as they come up. So definitely take advantage of that resource if you know, have any questions as things start to bloom and grow. And unfortunately, those insects start to invade our gardens, which is always the worst. I always cringe at you know, all the photos of all the bugs because you work so hard and then here they come.
You do, but I mean, for the most part, most insects aren't going to do tremendous amount of damage. And I think if you don't want to, like, our take on controlling insects is that you have to really weigh it and decide, is it important to control the insect, or can you deal with what little bit of damage they do for the time period that they do it? Because I mean, think about, like, I always like to put it in terms of the monarch caterpillar. Like, everybody is trying to attract monarchs, but the only way you can have monarchs is to allow the caterpillars to do what they do. So, and if you plant milkweed, the monarch caterpillars are going to destroy them, but it's necessary to have that if you want to have the butterflies.
Yeah, yeah. Always plant extra to sacrifice some to the
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Absolutely. Yeah, I see some of the comments just commenting on the same, you know,
Yeah.
heartbreak if you have a favorite plant or you're really trying to grow something and it just doesn't make
Yeah,
it.
and I mean, there's often friendly ways to deal with the insect. I mean, you know, hand picking and squishing. You know, if you're not too squeamish, that's a great way to deal with an insect problem without hurting anything else. You know, or using a less toxic. You know, when you do need to go for an insecticide, use something that's very targeting for that pest. You know.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I hope everyone enjoyed the presentation. I certainly did. A lot of people said thank you and that they learned a lot. So
Good.
thank you for your time today.
You're welcome.
And everyone just remember that we have lots of programs coming up. So be sure to check our catalog. We are open, so come in and visit us. We have lots of books on plants and all sorts of growing tips. So don't be shy if you're comfortable coming in. We are here for you. And we do have, you know, some programs in person. So if you're ready to come out and you feel comfortable with that, that's an option. But we're still going to be offering a lot of virtual programs as well. So email me with any questions you have. And thank you so much for joining us today. Everyone have a great day. And hopefully we get lots of sun this weekend.
That would be good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.